I'm Elena Rodriguez, 34, and the moment my family toasted to my sister as the real success at her baby shower, I knew it was time to shatter their carefully constructed reality. For years, I'd been the invisible daughter, the one who smiled quietly while they celebrated every milestone in Jessica's perfect life. But what they didn't know was that while they were busy fawning over her suburban fairy tale, I'd been building an empire they couldn't even imagine. The look on their faces when I stood up with my own toast? Absolutely priceless. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Growing up in the Rodriguez household meant understanding your place in the family hierarchy from an early age. My older sister Jessica was the golden child, the one who checked every box our parents had mentally prepared for their daughters. She was the homecoming queen, the straight-toss student who married her college sweetheart right after graduation. And now, at 36, she was preparing to welcome her second child into what everyone unanimously agreed was the most picture-perfect life imaginable. Then there was me, Elena, the middle child who somehow managed to fade into the background despite being perfectly capable of holding my own in any conversation. I wasn't rebellious enough to be memorable like my younger brother Miguel, who'd spent his 20s backpacking through Europe and changing career paths every 18 months. I was just there, the reliable one who showed up to family dinners, remembered birthdays, and listened patiently while everyone else's achievements took center stage. What my family didn't realize was that I'd learned early on how to use their assumptions about me to my advantage. While they saw a quiet, unassuming daughter who worked in something with computers, I'd actually spent the last 12 years building a portfolio that would make most financial advisors weep with envy. But I kept that information locked away, partly because I enjoyed the privacy, and partly because I'd grown tired of the way my family treated success as a competition. The baby shower invitation arrived on a Tuesday, printed on expensive cardstock with Jessica's monogram embossed in rose gold. "Join us in celebrating baby Rodriguez number 2, it announced in elegant script, followed by all the usual details about time, location, and registry information. I stared at it for a long moment, remembering the last family gathering where I'd been introduced to Jessica's friend as the sister who's still figuring things out. I'd smile politely then, the same way I always did, but something had shifted inside me that day. Maybe it was the patronizing tone, or maybe it was the way Jessica had immediately launched into a story about her latest home renovation project, effectively erasing me from the conversation entirely. Either way, I made a mental note to start keeping better track of these moments, these small slights that my family seemed to distribute so casually. The morning of the shower, I chose my outfit carefully. Nothing too flashy, nothing that would draw attention away from the guest of honor, but something that made me feel confident and put together. I settled on a navy blue dress that I'd bought during a business trip to New York, paired with the pearl earrings my grandmother had left me. Simple, elegant, forgettable, exactly what my family expected from me. The party was being held at my parents' house, the same sprawling colonial where we'd grown up. My mother had transformed the living room into a pastel paradise, complete with balloon arches, floral centerpieces, and enough pink and gold decorations to stock a small party store. Jessica sat in the center of it all like a queen holding court, her hands resting on her perfectly round belly, while friends and relatives took turns fawning over her glowing complexion and her husband David's promotion at the law firm. I arrived fashionably late, as had become my habit at family events. Not late enough to be rude, but late enough to avoid the initial rush of greetings and small talk that inevitably centered around questions I'd grown tired of answering. Still single? How's work? When are you going to settle down like your sister? The questions came with such predictable regularity that I'd started preparing generic responses that revealed absolutely nothing while sounding perfectly pleasant. My mother greeted me at the door with her usual mixture of affection and mild disappointment. Elena, sweetheart, you look lovely. Come say hello to Aunt Carmen. She's been asking about you. Aunt Carmen, my mother's older sister, had a tendency to speak in comparisons that always seemed to highlight what I wasn't accomplishing relative to Jessica's obvious achievements. Elena, mija, you look wonderful, Aunt Carmen said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like expensive perfume and judgment. Jessica was just telling us about the nursery renovation. Apparently, David surprised her with custom built-ins from that designer everyone's talking about. Isn't that romantic? When are you going to find yourself a man who treats you like a princess? I smiled the smile I perfected over years of practice, the one that suggested I was perfectly content with my life choices while revealing nothing about what those choices actually were. I'm keeping busy with work, Aunt Carmen. How have you been? She launched into a detailed account of her daughter's recent engagement, complete with commentary on the size of the ring and the venue they'd chosen for the reception. I nodded at appropriate intervals while mentally reviewing the quarterly reports I'd received the previous week from 3 different companies in my portfolio. One of them, a sustainable packaging startup I'd invested in 2 years ago, was about to announce a major contract with a national grocery chain. The projected returns would be enough to buy David's law firm, but I kept that information to myself. The afternoon proceeded exactly as I'd expected. Jessica opened gifts while everyone cooed over tiny outfits and unnecessary baby gadgets. My mother served lunch on her good china, the same set she'd inherited from her mother and only brought out for special occasions. The conversation flowed from pregnancy symptoms to childbirth stories to unsolicited parenting advice, with occasional detours into topics like home decorating and vacation planning. I contributed when appropriate, asking questions about due dates and commenting on the thoughtfulness of various gifts. But mostly, I observed, I watched the way my father's eyes lit up when Jessica mentioned that David was being considered for partner at his firm. I noticed how my mother immediately started planning a celebration dinner for when the promotion became official. I saw the way everyone leaned in when Jessica spoke, hanging on her words as if she were dispensing wisdom from on high. And I felt the familiar sensation of becoming invisible, of fading into the background while everyone else's attention focused on the person who mattered most in the room. It wasn't malicious, I knew that. My family loved me in their own way. But love and respect weren't always the same thing, and I'd learned to distinguish between the two over the years. The turning point came during dessert, when my mother stood up with the champagne flute filled with sparkling cider and called for everyone's attention. "I'd like to propose a toast," she announced, her voice carrying the formal tone she reserved for special occasions. "To Jessica, who continues to be everything we could have hoped for in a daughter. She's built a beautiful marriage, created a lovely home. And now she's expanding her family with another precious addition. She truly represents everything our family stands for, our real success story." End quote. The room erupted in enthusiastic agreement. Glasses clinked. People murmured their approval. And Jessica beamed with the satisfaction of someone who'd never questioned whether she deserved the praise being heaped upon her. I raised my own glass and smiled along with everyone else. But something inside me had reached its breaking point. Maybe it was the phrase "real success story" that did it, with its implication that success could only be measured in marriages and babies and suburban conformity. Maybe it was the way everyone nodded along, without considering that there might be other definitions of achievement worth celebrating. Or maybe it was simply the cumulative effect of years of being treated like a supporting character in my own family story. Whatever the reason, I found myself standing up before I'd consciously decided to do so. The conversation gradually quieted as people noticed my movement, and suddenly all eyes were on me. For a moment, I wondered if I was making a mistake, if I should just sit back down and let the moment pass. But then I saw the slightly puzzled expression on Jessica's face, the one that suggested she couldn't imagine what I might have to contribute to a toast about her accomplishments, and I knew I was exactly where I needed to be. "I'd like to add to that toast if I may," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. The room fell completely silent, which was unusual for a Rodriguez family gathering. We were a talkative bunch under normal circumstances, but something in my tone must have suggested that this wasn't going to be the usual generic congratulations. "Jessica, you're absolutely right to be proud of everything you've built," I began, making direct eye contact with my sister. "Marriage, family, a beautiful home, these are wonderful achievements that deserve recognition. But I think it's interesting how we define success in this family, how we measure worth and contribution." I could see my mother's face starting to reflect concern, probably wondering where I was going with this train of thought. My father set down his coffee cup and gave me his full attention, which was more focused interest than I'd received from him in months. "See, while everyone's been celebrating Jessica's very visible accomplishments, I've been building something too. Something that maybe doesn't fit the traditional definition of success that gets celebrated at family dinners, but something that I'm pretty proud of nonetheless." The silence in the room had become almost tangible. I could practically hear everyone's mental gears turning as they tried to figure out what I might be referring to. A secret boyfriend? A career change I hadn't mentioned? Some hobby that had gotten out of hand? "I own equity stakes in 10 different companies," I said clearly, letting each word land with deliberate precision. "Not stocks that I bought through a broker, not mutual funds that I contribute to through my retirement. Account. Actual ownership positions in businesses that I've either helped start or invested in during critical growth phases." The silence deepened, if such a thing was possible. I could see Aunt Carmen's mouth forming a small O of surprise, and Jessica's expression had shifted from puzzled to something approaching alarm. The sustainable packaging company that just landed the Whole Foods contract? I own 18% of that. The app development firm that created the platform 3 major airlines use for their customer service? 22%. The boutique consulting firm that advises Fortune 500 companies on digital transformation? I'm a founding partner with a 30% stake. I paused to take a sip of my sparkling cider, enjoying the way the bubbles felt against my tongue while I watched my family process this information. My brother Miguel was staring at me like I'd just announced I was secretly a CIA operative, which wasn't entirely far from how I felt in that moment. The medical device startup that's about to file for FDA approval on their revolutionary blood glucose monitor? 15%. The organic food distributor that supplies restaurant chains across the Southeast? 25%. The software company that develops inventory management systems for small businesses? 12%. I could see my father doing mental calculations, trying to estimate what these ownership stakes might be worth. As a retired accountant, he had a better grasp than most of the family on what I was really talking about. The green energy consulting firm that's consulting on the new solar installation projects in 3 different states? 35%. The boutique marketing agency that handles campaigns for several major consumer brands? 20%. The fintech startup that's revolutionizing small business lending? 14%. My mother had gone very still, the way she did when she was processing information that didn't fit her existing understanding of the world. Jessica was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Something between confusion and what might have been respect. "And the real estate development company that's building those luxury condominiums downtown, the ones that David mentioned wanting to look at last month? I own 42% of that company. We broke ground 6 months ago, and pre-sales are already exceeding projections by 30%. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 or 20 seconds. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "Elena, sweetheart, are you saying that these investments are, how significant are we talking about here?" I smiled, the first genuinely relaxed smile I'd felt all afternoon. "Well, Dad, let's just say that if I liquidated everything tomorrow, which I wouldn't because I believe in long-term growth strategies. But if I did, I could buy Jessica and David's house outright and still have enough left over to fund college educations for both of their children, plus a few more they haven't had yet. Aunt Carmen made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a laugh. But Elena, how is this possible? You never mentioned any of this. We thought you worked in IT support or something. I do work in technology, I replied calmly. I'm a senior systems architect for a cybersecurity firm, which is how I first started meeting entrepreneurs who needed both technical expertise and funding. I discovered I had a good eye for promising ventures and the patience to see long-term strategies through to completion. Jessica finally found her voice. But when did this happen? How long had you been doing this? About 12 years now, I said, settling back into my chair as if I were discussing the weather. It started small, with a friend from college who needed funding for an AAP idea. That first investment returned 8 times what I put in, so I started looking for other opportunities. I've always been good with numbers and research, so due diligence came naturally to me. 12 years? My mother's voice sounded faint. You've been doing this for 12 years and never mentioned it? It never seemed relevant to family conversations. I said with a shrug. When we get together, we usually talk about marriages and babies and home renovations. Business investments felt like they were outside the scope of what interested everyone. Miguel laughed, a sound that broke some of the tension in the room. Elena, this is insane. You're like a secret millionaire or something. I prefer the term private investor, I corrected with a smile. And I'm not exactly secret about it. I just don't see the need to discuss my financial portfolio at every family gathering. Though I have to admit, it's been interesting to observe how success gets defined and celebrated in different contexts. David, who had been quiet throughout this entire exchange, finally spoke up. Elena, I have to ask, and please don't take this the wrong way, but why are you telling us this now? Why today? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since I'd stood up to speak. Honestly, because I got tired of being treated like the family member who hadn't figured out how to build a successful life. I love Jessica, and I'm genuinely happy about her pregnancy and everything she's accomplished. But success isn't a zero-sum game, and it comes in more forms than just marriage and children. Jessica was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Elena, I had no idea. I mean, obviously I had no idea, but I never realized that you felt like, that we made you feel like you weren't successful. It's not anyone's fault, I said, and I meant it. I chose not to share this part of my life, so I can't blame anyone for not knowing about it. But I also chose to build something that matters to me, even if it doesn't look like what everyone expected. My father was still processing the financial implications. Elena, when you say you could buy their house outright, are you talking about having that kind of liquidity, or are you talking about theoretical net worth? A combination of both, I replied. I keep a diversified portfolio that includes some liquid assets for opportunities that require quick movement, but most of my wealth is tied up in the businesses themselves. The real estate development project alone is projected to return over $3 million to my initial investment when we complete the sales phase. $3 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. I could see everyone doing their own mental calculations, trying to figure out what kind of lifestyle that represented, what kind of security and freedom it implied. But you still live in that little apartment downtown, my mother said, as if she were trying to reconcile 2 conflicting pieces of information. I like my apartment, I said with a laugh. I said with a laugh. It's close to work, it has great natural light, and it's exactly the right size for my lifestyle. Having money doesn't mean you have to change everything about how you live. It just means you have more choices about what you want to change. "This is incredible," Aunt Carmen said, shaking her head. "Elena, mija, I don't know what to say. I feel like I owe you an apology for all those times I asked when you were going to find a husband and settle down." "No apology necessary," I assured her. Those questions never bothered me because I knew they came from a place of caring. I just had different priorities than what might have been obvious from the outside. The conversation that followed was unlike any family gathering I'd ever experienced. Instead of the usual surface-level chit-chat about weather and neighborhood gossip, people started asking me real questions about business, investment strategies, and entrepreneurship. My brother wanted to know if I'd ever consider backing his latest idea for a sustainable tourism company. My father peppered me with questions about market analysis and risk assessment. Even Jessica seemed genuinely curious about how I'd identified promising opportunities in such diverse industries. But the most surprising reaction came from my mother, who pulled me aside as people were starting to gather their things to leave. "Elena, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice uncharacteristically serious. "I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry that it took this long for me to understand what you've been building." "Mom, you don't need to apologize. I started," but she held up a hand to stop me. "Yes, I do. I've been so focused on celebrating the milestones I understood that I completely missed the fact that you were achieving things I couldn't even imagine. That's on me, not on you." It was perhaps the most honest conversation my mother and I had ever had, and it left me feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because I needed her approval to validate my choices, but because it felt good to be seen for who I actually was instead of who everyone had assumed I was. As the afternoon wound down and people started to leave, Jessica approached me with a expression that was part embarrassment and part admiration. "Elena, I feel like I owe you an apology too. I never realized that you might feel overlooked or undervalued in this family." "You don't owe me anything," I said, and I meant it. We've all been operating based on the information we had available. Now we have better information. But I think I understand now why you never seemed particularly interested in the things that excited me. She continued. "Your life is so much bigger than I realized. I mean, you're literally helping to fund innovation and create jobs and build things that matter." It was generous of her to frame it that way, and I appreciated the gesture. "Your life matters too, Jessica. Raising children, building a stable family, creating a home where people feel loved and supported, those are incredibly valuable contributions to the world. I never wanted to diminish that." "I know you didn't," she said with a smile. "But I think maybe I've been a little too focused on my own story to pay attention to yours." As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how the day had unfolded so differently than I'd expected. I'd arrived at the shower with no intention of revealing anything about my financial situation. The decision to speak up had been entirely spontaneous, driven by a moment of frustration that had been building for years. But now that the information was out there, I found myself feeling unexpectedly relieved. Not because I'd needed my family's validation, but because I was tired of maintaining the careful separation between my professional success and my personal relationships. It had required a surprising amount of energy to constantly monitor what I said and didn't say, to downplay achievements and deflect questions about my lifestyle and choices. The next few weeks brought a series of interesting conversations with various family members. My brother called to discuss his business idea in more detail, and I ended up agreeing to provide some seed funding for his sustainable tourism venture after reviewing his business plan and market research. My father invited me to lunch so he could pick my brain about investment strategies for his retirement portfolio. Even some of Jessica's friends reached out through her to ask if I ever consulted on financial planning for small business owners. But perhaps the most significant change was in the dynamic of our family gatherings. At the next monthly dinner, Instead of the conversation revolving entirely around Jessica's pregnancy updates and David's career progress, people actually asked me about my work and my investments. Not in a way that felt invasive or demanding, but with genuine interest and respect for what I'd built. I realized that part of the problem had been my own assumption that my family wouldn't be interested in or capable of understanding what I did professionally. I created the very invisibility I'd grown to resent by refusing to share information that might have led to more meaningful connections. It wasn't that I regretted keeping my business affairs private for so many years. Privacy had allowed me to develop my investment philosophy and build my portfolio without outside pressure or unwanted advice. But there was something valuable about being able to discuss my work with people who cared about me, even if they didn't always understand the technical details. The real estate development project I'd mentioned ended up exceeding even my optimistic projections. When the luxury condominiums went on the market 6 months later, they sold faster than anyone had anticipated, and my 42% stake returned almost $4 million above my initial investment. I celebrated by taking my entire family on a vacation to Costa Rica, where Miguel's sustainable tourism company was planning to lodge its first eco-resort. It was during that trip, as I watched my parents snorkeling in clear blue water and my sister chasing her toddler along the pristine beach, that I understood something important about success and family and the stories we can tell ourselves about both. Success isn't just about financial returns or professional achievements, though those things certainly matter. It's also about the relationships you build, the experiences you create, and the ways you choose to share your good fortune with the people you care about. I'd spent so many years focused on building wealth that I'd almost forgotten why wealth mattered in the first place. But it's also true that success can't be defined by other people's expectations or limited to their understanding of what achievement looks like. For too long, I'd allowed my family's narrow definition of success to make me feel invisible and undervalued, when the real problem was that I hadn't been willing to share the parts of my life that didn't fit their rindy preconceptions. The baby shower revelation had been about more than just correcting misconceptions or asserting my worth. It had been about claiming space for a different kind of success story, one that didn't follow the traditional script of marriage and children and suburban conformity. Jessica's second child, a daughter named Sophia, was born on a sunny Tuesday morning in October. I was one of the first people to visit them in the hospital, and as I held my new niece and watched Jessica glow with the exhausted happiness of new motherhood, I felt nothing but genuine joy for her accomplishments. But I also felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that my own accomplishments were finally part of the family narrative, that my success story was no longer a secret I carried alone. When Sophia was old enough to understand such things, she would grow up knowing that there were many different ways to build a meaningful life, and that success could look like whatever she decided it should look like. The sustainable packaging company went public 2 years later, and my 18% stake was suddenly worth more than I'd ever imagined when I'd made that first investment. The medical device startup received FDA approval and signed distribution deals that revolutionized diabetes management for millions of people. The green energy consulting firm expanded into 5 new states and became a major player in the renewable energy transition. Each success felt different than it had when I'd been celebrating them alone. Not better, necessarily, but more connected to the rest of my life, more integrated into the story I was telling about who I was and what mattered to me. At Sophia's first birthday party, my mother stood up to make a toast that was very different from the one she'd given at Jessica's baby shower. "I want to raise a glass to both of my daughters," she said, looking between Jessica and me with equal pride. Jessica, who has built a beautiful family and continues to amaze us with her grace and strength as a mother, and Elena, who has built an empire while we were paying attention and who continues to show us new definitions of what it means to be successful. She paused to smile at both of us before continuing. I've learned that success comes in many forms, and that the most important thing is not how other people measure your achievements, but how you choose to use your talents and opportunities to make a difference in the world. It was a more thoughtful and nuanced toast than I might have expected from her a few years earlier, and it represented a kind of growth that I found deeply moving. My family had learned to see me differently, but they'd also learned to think more broadly about success and achievement and the many different ways a life could be meaningful. As I looked around the room at my family and friends, at my brother who was successfully launching his ecotourism company with my backing, at my parents who had retired comfortably with investment advice I'd provided, at Jessica who was thriving in her role as a mother while also starting to explore some entrepreneurial ideas of her own, I realized that the best investment I'd ever made wasn't in any company or real estate project. It was in the decision to stop hiding parts of myself out of fear that they wouldn't be understood or appreciated. It was in the choice to claim space for my own definition of success, even when that meant challenging other people's assumptions about what my life should look like. The quiet daughter had found her voice, and it turned out she had quite a lot to say. Not just about business and investments, but about family and belonging and the courage it takes to be fully yourself in a world that often expects you to be someone smaller and more conventional. At Sophia's party, as we all gathered around to watch her take her first wobbly steps, I thought about the steps I'd taken to get to this moment. Some of them had been financial, calculated moves in boardrooms and investment meetings, but the most important ones had been personal, moments when I'd chosen to be authentic instead of invisible, to speak up instead of staying silent, to claim my place in the family story instead of accepting a supporting role. Success, I'd learned, wasn't just about building wealth or achieving professional recognition. It was about building a life that felt authentically yours, surrounded by people who saw and valued who you really were. And sometimes, it took a baby shower toast to realize that you had the power to change the story everyone was telling about your life, including the story you were telling yourself. The investments continued to pay off, both financially and personally. But the real return on investment had been the relationship I built with my family once I'd stopped assuming they couldn't handle the truth about who I was and what I'd accomplished. It turned out that the only person who had been underestimating me was myself, and the only approval I'd really needed was my own. Years later, when people asked me about the secret to successful investing, I would tell them about research and patience and diversification and risk management. But I would also tell them about the importance of being willing to bet on yourself, even when no one else understands what you're building. Especially then. Because sometimes the best investments are the ones that pay dividends not just in your bank account, but in your relationships, your self-respect, and your understanding of what it really means to live a successful life. And sometimes the most important toast you'll ever give is the one where you finally tell the truth about who you are and what you've built, while everyone else was looking the other way. 3 years after Sophia's first birthday, my life took an unexpected turn that would have been impossible to predict, even with all my market analysis skills. I received a call from Rebecca Chen, the CEO of the sustainable packaging company where I held my 18% stake. She was calling to inform me that a major international conglomerate wanted to acquire the entire company, and they were offering a price that would make my stake worth approximately $15 million. The offer was generous, almost ridiculously so, but it also represented the end of one of my most successful and personally meaningful investments. I'd been involved with the company since its early days, when Rebecca was still running operations out of her garage and pitching to grocery stores with handmade prototypes. Watching her build something from nothing had been one of the most rewarding aspects of my investment career. "Elena, I wanted you to hear this from me first," Rebecca said during our call. "This acquisition would change everything, obviously. But it would also mean that our partnership comes to an end. I know how much you've contributed to getting us to this point, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to weigh in, Tron, on the decision. Why? Why? It was a courtesy she didn't owe me, but one that reflected the kind of relationship we built over the years. Unlike some of my other investments, where my involvement was purely financial, I'd taken an active role in helping Rebecca navigate some of the challenges that came with rapid growth. We'd developed a genuine friendship alongside our business relationship. Rebecca, this is your company and your decision, I told her. But if you're asking for my opinion, I think you should take the offer. You've built something incredible, and this acquisition will give you the resources to scale in ways that would take decades to achieve independently. The acquisition went through 6 months later, and suddenly I found myself with more liquid capital than I'd ever imagined having. It was an exciting problem to have, but also a daunting one. $15 million represented not just financial security, but responsibility. How I chose to deploy that capital would impact not just my own future, but potentially the futures of entrepreneurs I hadn't even met yet. I decided to take a different approach than I'd used in the past. Instead of looking for individual companies to invest in, I started exploring the possibility of starting my own venture capital fund. It would allow me to make more strategic investments while also providing mentorship and support to entrepreneurs who were building companies with social and environmental impact. The process of establishing Rodriguez Ventures turned out to be more complex than I'd anticipated. There were regulatory requirements, legal structures to establish, and a network of limited partners to cultivate. I spent months meeting with attorneys, accountants, and other fund managers, learning about the intricacies of institutional investing. During this period, my family dynamic continued to evolve in ways that surprised me. Jessica, who had always seemed perfectly content with her role as wife and mother, started expressing interest in entrepreneurship. She'd been volunteering with a local organization that provided support to new mothers, and she'd identified what she believed was a significant gap in the market for postpartum care services. "Elena, I've been thinking about what you said at my baby shower," she told me during one of our monthly coffee dates, a new tradition we'd established after Sophia was born, about there being different ways to define success and build a meaningful life. "I think I want to try building something of my own." She'd been researching the postpartum care industry and had developed a detailed business plan for a service that would provide in-home support for new mothers during the critical first few months after birth. The concept was compelling, addressing a real need that she understood intimately from her own experience. "I know I don't have any business experience," she continued, "but I have something that a lot of entrepreneurs don't have, which is deep personal knowledge of the problem I'm trying to solve. And I was wondering if you might be willing to provide some guidance, maybe even consider it as an investment opportunity." "Oh?" It was the first time Jessica had ever asked for my professional advice about anything, and I found myself unexpectedly moved by her request. Not because I needed her validation, but because it represented a fundamental shift in how she saw both herself and me. She was no longer content to be defined solely by her relationships to other people, and she was beginning to see me as someone whose expertise had value beyond my ability to write checks. We spent the next several weeks working together on refining her business model and developing financial projections. It was a collaborative process that revealed sides of both of us that had never emerged during typical family interactions. Jessica had a natural intuition for customer needs and market dynamics, while I brought analytical skills and industry knowledge that helped her think through operational challenges. The business plan she ultimately developed was impressive enough that I agreed to provide seed funding through my new venture capital fund. But more importantly, working together had created a new kind of relationship between us, one based on mutual respect and shared professional interests rather than just family obligation. Miguel's ecotourism company had also reached an inflection point. The initial resort in Costa Rica had been successful enough to attract attention from international travel companies, and he was fielding offers for expansion partnerships that would allow him to develop similar properties in other Central American countries. Elena, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me, he said during a family dinner where he was updating everyone on his business progress. Do you think I'm ready for this kind of expansion, or am I getting ahead of myself? It was a more serious question than Miguel typically asked about anything, and it reflected how much he'd matured since launching his company. The carefree backpacker who'd changed careers every 18 months had evolved into a thoughtful entrepreneur who understood the weight of the decisions he was making. I think the question isn't whether you're ready, I replied, but whether you have the right support systems in place to handle the complexity that comes with rapid growth. Expansion can be incredibly rewarding, but it can also destroy companies that aren't prepared for the McCain operational challenges. We ended up spending several hours that evening discussing partnership structures, due diligence processes, and growth strategies. By the end of the conversation, Miguel had decided to accept one of the partnership offers, but with a more conservative timeline than originally proposed. Watching both of my siblings develop their entrepreneurial instincts was fascinating from a family dynamics perspective, but it also made me realize how much my own approach to business had been shaped by operating in isolation. I'd become accustomed to making decisions independently, without the benefit of family input or support. Now that my professional life was more integrated with my personal relationships, I found myself thinking differently about risk, growth, and the purpose of building wealth. Rodriguez Ventures officially launched 18 months after the sustainable packaging acquisition closed. My inaugural fund raised $28 million from a combination of high-net-worth individuals, family offices, and institutional investors who were interested in impact-focused investing. It was smaller than some of the established venture capital funds, but it was large enough to make meaningful investments in early-stage companies. The fund's investment thesis focused on companies that were addressing social or environmental challenges while also having the potential for significant financial returns. It was a philosophy that had evolved from my own investment experience, where I discovered that some of the most successful companies were also the ones that were solving important problems. Our first investment was in a health technology company that had developed a platform for connecting patients with specialized medical providers in underserved communities. The founders were two women who had met while working at a large hospital system and had become frustrated with the barriers that prevented patients from accessing appropriate care. The investment process was different from anything I'd done as an individual investor. Instead of making decisions in isolation, I was now part of a team that included other investment professionals, industry advisors, and portfolio company executives. The collaborative approach was more complex than my previous methods, but it also led to better outcomes and more comprehensive support for the entrepreneurs we were backing. As Rodriguez Ventures grew, I found myself becoming a more public figure in the venture capital community. I was invited to speak at conferences, participate in panel discussions, and contribute to industry publications. It was a level of professional visibility that I'd never sought, but that seemed to come naturally with the territory of running a fund. The attention was flattering, but it also created new challenges. Suddenly, every family gathering included questions from extended relatives who had read about my fund in business publications or seen me quoted in articles about women in venture capital. The privacy I'd maintained for so many years was no longer sustainable, but I found that I didn't miss it as much as I'd expected. Jessica's postpartum care company, which she'd named Nurture Network, launched 2 years after we'd first discussed the concept. The service model she developed was more sophisticated than either of us had initially envisioned, combining in-home care providers with telehealth consultations and peer support networks. The company's growth exceeded even my optimistic projections. Within 6 months of launching, Nurture Network was operating in 3 cities and had a waiting list of families who wanted to access their services. Jessica had discovered that she had natural leadership abilities and a gift for building teams around shared mission and values. Elena, I never thanked you properly for believing in this idea when it was just a concept, Jessica told me at the company's 1-year anniversary celebration. But more than that, I never thanked you for showing me that it was possible to build something meaningful, even when no one else could see the vision. It was an acknowledgement that meant more to me than any financial return could have. Jessica hadn't just built a successful company, she'd discovered parts of herself that had been dormant for years. She was still a devoted mother and wife, but she was also a CEO, a leader, and an entrepreneur who was making a tangible difference in other people's lives. Miguel's ecotourism expansion had been equally successful, though in different ways. Instead of pursuing rapid growth, he'd chosen a more sustainable approach that prioritized environmental impact and community development. His partnership with the international travel company had allowed him to develop 3 new properties, each one designed to showcase local culture and support indigenous communities. I used to think success meant constantly moving on to the next thing, he told me during a family vacation at his newest resort in Guatemala. But I've learned that sometimes success means staying in one place long enough to really understand what you're building and why it matters. The conversation took place as we were sitting on a deck overlooking a pristine lake, surrounded by mountains and jungle. The resort was beautiful, but what impressed me most was how seamlessly it integrated with the natural environment and local community. Miguel had created something that was both commercially viable and environmentally responsible. My parents had also been transformed by watching their children develop into successful entrepreneurs. My father had started volunteering with a local small business development center, using his accounting background to help other people navigate the financial aspects of starting companies. My mother had become involved with a nonprofit that provided mentorship to women entrepreneurs, drawing on her experience watching Jessica and me build our respective ventures. I never imagined that all 3 of my children would end up as business owners, my father said during a family dinner celebrating the 5th anniversary of my baby shower revelation. But I also never imagined how much I would learn from watching you all build something from nothing. The family dynamic had shifted completely from the hierarchical structure that had defined my childhood. Instead of Jessica being the golden child while Miguel and I played supporting roles, we become more like equals, who brought different strengths and perspectives to our shared experiences. Rodriguez Ventures continued to grow, both in terms of assets under management and portfolio company success. Our health technology investment had been acquired by a major healthcare conglomerate for 8 times our initial investment. The sustainable agriculture startup we'd backed had secured partnerships with 3 major food retailers. The educational technology company had expanded into 12 states and was being used by over 200,000 students. But the most rewarding aspect of running the fund wasn't the financial returns, though those were certainly satisfying. It was the opportunity to work with entrepreneurs who were tackling problems that mattered, and to provide them with not just capital but also strategic guidance and network connections that could accelerate their growth. One of our portfolio companies, founded by a former teacher who had developed innovative curriculum for underserved schools, reminded me of why I'd gotten into investing in the first place. The founder, Maria Santos, had the same combination of passionate commitment and analytical rigor that I'd seen in the most successful entrepreneurs I'd worked with over the years. Elena, when I first started this company, people told me that education technology was too crowded, that there were already too many solutions in the market, Maria told me during one of our quarterly board meetings. But you understood that what I was building was different because it was designed specifically for the communities that other companies were ignoring. It was exactly the kind of insight that made venture capital rewarding on a personal level, beyond just the financial metrics. Maria hadn't just built a successful company, she'd created tools that were helping thousands of children access better educational opportunities. The impact was measurable and meaningful in ways that went far beyond return on investment calculations. As Rodriguez Ventures approached its 5th anniversary, I started thinking about legacy and what I wanted to accomplish in the next phase of my career. The fund had been successful by any reasonable measure, but I was beginning to feel like I wanted to tackle even bigger challenges and have even greater impact. The idea that eventually emerged was to establish a nonprofit foundation that would work alongside the venture capital fund, providing grants and support to entrepreneurs who were addressing problems that might not be commercially viable but were socially important. It would allow me to invest in solutions to problems like homelessness, educational equity, and environmental justice that were difficult to address through traditional venture capital models. The foundation concept required a different kind of planning than anything I'd done before. Instead of focusing primarily on financial returns, I had to think about social impact metrics, program evaluation, and long-term sustainability. It was intellectually challenging in ways that pure venture capital investing had never been. Jessica became one of my key advisors on the foundation development, bringing insights from her experience running a company with a social mission. Miguel contributed perspectives on community development and environmental sustainability. Even my parents offered valuable input based on their volunteer work with various nonprofit organizations. The collaborative approach to developing the foundation felt like the natural evolution of how my family relationships had changed since the baby shower revelation. Instead of operating in separate spheres, we were now actively supporting each other's professional and personal growth in ways that created value for everyone involved. Rodriguez Foundation launched with an initial endowment of $10 million and a focus on supporting innovative solutions to complex social problems. Our first major grant went to an organization that was developing new models for affordable housing in urban areas. Our second supported a program that was training formerly incarcerated individuals for careers in technology. The foundation work was different from venture capital investing in almost every way, but it drew on many of the same skills I developed over the years. Evaluating grant proposals required similar analytical abilities to assessing investment opportunities. Supporting grantee organizations demanded the same kind of strategic thinking that I used when advising portfolio companies. But the emotional rewards were different, and in many ways more profound. When I visited the affordable housing project 6 months after our initial grant, I met families who were living in decent, safe homes because of programs we'd supported. When I attended the graduation ceremony for the technology training program, I shook hands with people who had transformed their lives through skills they'd learned with our funding. The foundation work also created new opportunities for family involvement. Jessica joined the board of directors, bringing her expertise in program evaluation and community engagement. Miguel became an advisor on environmental and sustainability issues. My parents started volunteering with some of our grantee organizations, contributing their time and experience to programs they believed in. By the time Sophia turned 7, the Rodriguez family had become something entirely different from what it had been during my childhood. Instead of the hierarchy based on traditional measures of success, we'd become a network of entrepreneurs, investors, and social innovators who were actively supporting each other's work and amplifying each other's impact. The baby shower revelation had been the catalyst for all of these changes, but it hadn't been the destination. The real transformation had happened gradually through hundreds of conversations, collaborative projects, and shared experiences that had redefined what success meant to all of us. Looking back, I realized that the most important thing I'd learned wasn't about investing or entrepreneurship or family dynamics. It was about the power of authenticity and the unexpected opportunities that emerge when you stop hiding parts of yourself because you're afraid they won't be understood or appreciated. The quiet daughter hadn't just found her voice, she discovered that her voice could inspire others to find theirs as well. And that, more than any financial return or professional recognition, felt like the definition of a life well lived. But life has a way of presenting new challenges just when you think you've figured everything out. 2 years after the foundation launched, I received a phone call that would test everything I'd learned about resilience, family, and the true meaning of success. It was my father calling at 6 in the morning, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Elena, we need you to come to the hospital. Your mother collapsed during her morning walk, and the doctors are running tests." The drive to the hospital felt endless, despite taking only 20 minutes. My mind raced through possibilities, probabilities, and preparations that my analytical nature demanded even in crisis. But underneath the mental calculations was a deeper fear that I hadn't experienced since childhood. The terror of losing someone who had become not just a parent, but a genuine friend and advisor. The diagnosis was a stroke, moderate but significant enough to require immediate intervention and an uncertain recovery timeline. As I sat in the sterile waiting room with Jessica and Miguel, I realized that all the business success in the world couldn't protect us from the fundamental vulnerability of being human, of loving people whose mortality, HE, was beyond our control. The next several months reorganized our family's priorities in ways that no strategic planning session could have anticipated. Jessica temporarily stepped back from day-to-day operations at Nurture Network to coordinate our mother's care. Miguel flew back from Guatemala more frequently than his business could easily accommodate. I found myself spending more time at my parents' house than I had since college, managing medical appointments and insurance claims between foundation board meetings and venture capital due diligence calls. The experience of caring for our mother revealed new dimensions of each of our personalities that had been invisible during the years when we'd all been focused on building our respective careers. Jessica's natural leadership abilities extended far beyond business into crisis management and family coordination. Miguel's laid-back personality masked a fierce loyalty and determination that emerged when people he loved were threatened. I discovered that my analytical skills were equally valuable for navigating healthcare systems as they were for evaluating investment opportunities. But perhaps the most profound discovery was how much our mother had internalized the lessons about different definitions of success that had emerged from our family's transformation. Even while dealing with physical therapy and speech recovery, she insisted on continuing her volunteer work with the Women's Entrepreneurship Organization, albeit in modified ways. "I spent too many years measuring my worth by other people's achievements," she told me during one of our conversations in her hospital room. "I'm not going to spend whatever time I have left going backward to that way of thinking." Her recovery was slower than any of us had hoped, but more complete than the doctors had initially predicted. 6 months after the stroke, she was walking independently and speaking with only minor word-finding difficulties. But the experience had changed her perspective on time and priorities in ways that influenced how our entire family approached their work and relationships. The crisis had also revealed something important about the businesses we'd all built. Despite requiring significant time away from regular operations, none of our ventures had suffered serious setbacks. Jessica's team at Nurture Network had stepped up to maintain service quality and growth momentum. Miguel's partners in the ecotourism company had managed the day-to-day operations while he focused on family responsibilities. Rodriguez Ventures and the foundation had continued functioning smoothly thanks to the strong teams I'd assembled over the years. It was a lesson in the importance of building sustainable systems rather than depending entirely on individual leadership, and it influenced how I thought about scaling both the venture capital fund and the foundation in the future. During our mother's recovery period, I also received an unexpected opportunity that would reshape my career trajectory once again. Dr. Patricia Williams, the president of a prestigious university with a renowned business school, reached out to ask if I would consider joining their faculty as a professor of entrepreneurship and venture capital. "Elena, we have been following your work with Rodriguez Ventures and the foundation. and we believe you represent exactly the kind of practitioner-educator our students need," she explained during our initial conversation. "We're not talking about a traditional academic appointment. We want someone who can bring real-world experience into the classroom while also conducting research that advances the field." The offer was intriguing, but also daunting. I'd never considered academia as a career path, and the idea of teaching fell completely outside my comfort zone. But there was something appealing about the opportunity to influence the next generation of entrepreneurs and investors, to share lessons that might help them avoid some of the mistakes I'd made and build more sustainable, impactful businesses. After several weeks of consideration and family consultation, I accepted a part-time appointment that would allow me to continue running Rodriguez Ventures while also developing curriculum and teaching courses on impact investing and entrepreneurial finance. The transition to academic life was more challenging than I'd anticipated. Students asked questions I'd never considered, challenged assumptions I'd taken for granted, and forced me to articulate knowledge that I'd previously operated on through intuition and experience. But it was also intellectually stimulating in ways that pure investment work had never been. My first course was a seminar on venture capital for social impact, limited to 15 MBA students who were interested in careers that combined financial returns with social outcomes. The students came from diverse backgrounds, including former consultants, nonprofit workers, engineers, and social activists who had decided to pursue business education. Teaching them required me to codify investment principles that I'd developed organically over 15 years of practice. It also forced me to stay current with academic research on topics like impact measurement, stakeholder capitalism, and sustainable business models that I'd previously approached from a purely practical perspective. But the most rewarding aspect of teaching was watching students develop their own perspectives on how business could be a force for positive change. Many of them had chosen business school specifically because they believed that entrepreneurship and investing could address social problems more effectively than traditional nonprofit or government approaches. One student, David Kim, had left a lucrative consulting job to pursue an MBA because he wanted to start a company that would address food insecurity in urban areas. Another, Sarah Martinez, had been working in international development and was exploring how venture capital could support social enterprises in emerging markets. Their passion and idealism reminded me of why I'd been drawn to impact investing in the first place, but their fresh perspectives also challenged me to think more rigorously about measurement, accountability, and long-term sustainability. The academic appointment also created opportunities for research collaborations that would never have emerged from pure investment practice. I began working with colleagues in the social psychology department on studies of entrepreneurial motivation and decision-making under uncertainty. I partnered with environmental scientists on research into the effectiveness of market-based solutions to climate change. One of these research projects led to a significant breakthrough in how I thought about the Foundation's work. Dr. Jennifer Liu, a colleague in the public policy school, had been studying why some social interventions scaled successfully, while others remained limited to pilot programs despite demonstrated effectiveness. "Elena, I think there's an opportunity to apply venture capital principles to social innovation in ways that could dramatically improve outcomes," she suggested during one of our conversations. Instead of traditional grant-making, what if foundations operated more like impact investors, providing not just funding but also strategic support and network connections? The idea sparked a complete reconsideration of Rodriguez Foundation's operating model. Instead of making one-time grants to organizations, we began experimenting with multi-year partnerships that included ongoing strategic advising, connections to other funders and partners, and systematic evaluation of results. Our first pilot of this approach was with an organization called Urban Roots that was developing innovative programs for youth development in low-income neighborhoods. Instead of providing a traditional $50,000 grant, we offered a 3-year partnership worth $200,000 that included quarterly strategic planning sessions, introductions to potential corporate partners, and access to our network of business advisors. The results exceeded our most optimistic projections. Urban Roots was able to expand from 1 neighborhood to 5, develop sustainable revenue streams that reduce their dependence on grant funding, and create a replicable model that other organizations began adopting in different cities. The success of the Urban Roots partnership led to similar collaborations with organizations working on problems ranging from affordable healthcare access to educational equity to environmental conservation. The foundation's impact per dollar invested increased dramatically, but more importantly, we were helping to build a more sustainable ecosystem of social innovation. These experiments in blending venture capital and philanthropy also influenced my academic research and teaching. I began developing case studies based on our foundation's work that could help other investors and philanthropists think more strategically about social impact. The academic and practical work created a virtuous cycle where each area informed and strengthened the other. My teaching forced me to be more rigorous about documenting and analyzing our investment and foundation strategies. The research collaborations introduced new frameworks and methodologies that improved our decision-making. The Foundation's innovative partnerships provided real-world examples that enriched my classroom discussions. But perhaps the most significant development during this period was watching how the integration of my different roles influenced my siblings' approaches to their own work. Jessica began incorporating more systematic evaluation into Nurture Networks programs, using frameworks she'd learned from observing the Foundation's work. Miguel started exploring partnerships with academic researchers who could help him measure and communicate the environmental impact of his ecotourism properties. The family's Sunday dinners, which had once focused on personal updates and small talk, increasingly became strategic planning sessions where we shared challenges, brainstormed solutions, and leveraged each other's ST, networks, and expertise. It was a level of professional collaboration that would have been unimaginable during the years when I'd kept my investment activities secret. Sophia, now 10 years old, had grown up watching these conversations and seemed to absorb lessons about entrepreneurship and social impact as naturally as other children learned about sports or music. She started her own small business selling handmade jewelry to raise money for animal shelters, applying principles of market research and customer service that she'd overheard during family discussions. Aunt Elena, I've been thinking about scaling my jewelry business, she announced during one family dinner, using terminology that would have been hilarious if it hadn't been delivered with such serious 10-year-old intensity. But I need to understand my unit economics better before I expand into new product lines. It was a reminder that children absorb everything they observe, and that the conversations happening around them shape their understanding of what's possible and important in life. Sophia was growing up with a completely different set of assumptions about work, success, and social responsibility than Jessica, Miguel, and I had internalized during our own childhoods. The university appointment also led to speaking opportunities at conferences and workshops around the world. I found myself presenting research findings at academic conferences in London and Sao Paulo, leading workshops for impact investors in Singapore and Toronto, and participating in policy discussions in Croxon, Washington, and Brussels. The international exposure revealed how universal many of the challenges we were addressing actually were. Entrepreneurs in Kenya were grappling with similar access to capital issues as founders in Cleveland. Social innovators in India were developing solutions to problems that existed in modified forms in American cities. The specific contexts were different, but the underlying dynamics of market failure, resource constraints, and scaling challenges were remarkably consistent across geographic boundaries. This global perspective influenced both my teaching and my investment strategies. I began incorporating more international case studies into my courses, helping students understand that entrepreneurship and impact investing were not exclusively American phenomena. Rodriguez Ventures started evaluating opportunities in emerging markets, partnering with local investors who understood regulatory environments and cultural contexts that would have been impossible for us to navigate independently. One of these international partnerships led to our investment in a financial technology company based in Mexico City that was developing mobile banking solutions for unbanked populations. The founders, Maria Elena Gutierrez and Carlos Mendoza, had identified market opportunities that reminded me of problems I'd seen in urban American communities, but their solutions were specifically designed for the Mexican regulatory environment and customer base. The investment required more due diligence and ongoing support than our typical domestic deals, but it also provided insights into how technology could address financial inclusion challenges that existed globally. The company's success opened doors to additional international opportunities and partnerships that expanded our understanding of impact investing beyond our original American focus. These international experiences also influenced the Foundation's work. We began supporting organizations that were developing innovative solutions to global problems, even when their immediate focus was local implementation. A water purification technology developed in rural Guatemala might have applications in rural American communities. An educational program designed for refugee populations might provide insights relevant to immigrant communities in American cities. The interconnectedness of social challenges became increasingly apparent as I gained exposure to different contexts and approaches. Problems that seemed uniquely American often had parallels in other countries, and solutions that emerged in one context frequently had broader applications than their creators had initially recognized. By the time Rodriguez Ventures reached its 10th anniversary, the fund had grown to manage over $100 million across multiple vintages. Our portfolio included 43 companies spanning sectors from healthcare and education to financial services and environmental technology. More importantly, our portfolio companies had created over 2,000 jobs and were serving millions of customers with products and services that addressed real social and environmental needs. The Foundation had evolved into a respected player in the impact philanthropy space, managing an endowment of $35 million and supporting a network of social enterprises and advocacy organizations, across multiple issue areas. Our innovative partnership model had been adopted by other foundations and had influenced policy discussions about the future of social sector funding. But the metric that mattered most to me wasn't financial returns or programmatic outcomes, though those were certainly important. It was the extent to which our work was creating opportunities for other people to build meaningful careers addressing problems that mattered. The entrepreneurs we'd supported were now mentoring the next generation of founders. The students I taught were starting their own companies or joining organizations that were working on social and environmental challenges. The ripple effects extended far beyond what I could track or measure, but I caught glimpses of the impact through unexpected connections and conversations. A former student would email to tell me about a job she'd taken with a social enterprise. An entrepreneur from our portfolio would mention a partnership with an organization we'd supported through the Foundation. A researcher I'd collaborated with would reference our work in a policy paper that influenced government funding decisions. Each of these connections reminded me that the most important investments we make are often in people and relationships rather than just companies or programs. The financial returns from Rodriguez Ventures had been substantial, but the social returns from building a network of people committed to using business as a force for positive change were immeasurable. As I reflected on the journey from that baby shower revelation to the integrated portfolio of activities I was now managing, I realized that the original moment of frustration had been about much more than family recognition or professional validation. It had been about the need to live authentically, to integrate all aspects of my identity rather than compartmentalizing different parts of my life. The quiet daughter who had stood up at Jessica's baby shower hadn't just been asserting her professional accomplishments. She had been claiming the right to be seen as a whole person, someone whose contributions to the world extended beyond traditional family roles and societal expectations. That moment of authenticity had created space not just for my own growth, but for the growth of everyone around me.